So let's talk about how we can start putting colliders on our prefabs so that when the player walks through the level, he doesn't fall through the floor or able to clip through the walls. You can see I've kind of fast forwarded here and created a few more prefabs that might suit our level more. I'll give you a preview of all of these, as well as go through the steps we need to put colliders on our meshes here. So what we're going to do, we're just going to go through each one of these. I'm just going to drop them in my hierarchy, make sure the transformations are still zeroed out. And here's just a little wall I made that can house a doorway or an arch. What we need to do now is we need to go to each component within our mesh here and make a collider. As a rule of thumb, if the shape is simple enough, you want to use a simple shaped collider. When an object has multiple angles and organic shapes, sometimes you may have to use a simple mesh collider. So what does that mean, a mesh collider versus a simple shape collider? Well, let's go ahead and let's bring in our straight hallway. And let's move it over here. Alright, why don't we get rid of our double door and we'll just look at our straight hallway real quickly. It has a good mix of what we might need for a mesh collider and what we might need for a simple shape collider. Alright, so this hallway is a little bit more advanced than the one I built earlier, and it has a dipped floor, a columned right wall, and a flat left wall. So what we want to do is we want to maximize the performance of our game engine by putting the appropriate colliders on our objects here. Okay? And here's a good point. Here's a good little mistake you might make. Look at this little gap in this prefab. You can see how this ceiling is not quite snapped to this wall. So you want to pay attention to that when you're building your prefabs. So let's go ahead and fix that error real quick by snapping and snapping. Just that little bit of a difference can make sure that you don't have any seams in your level that can cause eyesores and distract the viewer from enjoying your level. So let's select this simple wall right here. And what we need to do is we need to go in our inspector and we need to add a component to add a collider to this. So we'll go to add component. And we'll go with in physics, we'll go with a simple box collider. So what does that mean? Well, now you can see that I have a greenish outline around this wall here. And then within your box collider component, we can now start to tweak the diameter and the shape of this green box. This wireframe green box is what dictates how objects such as the player may interact with the player. Let's bring that back so I can control its width. And I want to make its width a little bit more than I need, and maybe make its size just a little bit more, like so. And now we have a nice box collider on our flat wall. So let's add a box collider to our floor here. We'll select our floor. We'll go to add component, physics, box collider. Well, does that work? You might be, see how the top of this wireframe says that you might be floating on top of the floor a little bit? Well, here's a decision you have to make on the fly here. Is a player going to notice whenever it's walking through this level if it's down on the depressed part of the floor or up on the top? If your game can budget the extra performance hits that more complex colliders can do, then maybe just go ahead and throw a mesh collider on there. But with this floor, I'm just going to go ahead and fib it. I'm going to lower its Y value. It'll cooperate. And I'm actually going to use the center tool here and lower it a little bit. That way we can kind of fib whether or not the player is going to be standing on this curved, indented floor. In a first-person view, it's not going to matter too much. But if we try to put a box collider on this, we want the player to be able to collide into these columns. Well, yeah, let's go ahead and try to do that. So how can we get the player to collide into these columns? A box collider, make 3 box colliders and have one. That doesn't make sense. Let's go to Add Component, go to Physics, and let's just add a Mesh Collider. A Mesh Collider basically takes the geometry of the existing object and makes every single line, every single vertex a part of its collider. So now we have a nice collidable object here. And for the ceiling, let's just leave the ceiling without any kind of collider, because we're not going to be able to jump through it. So we'll save on the engine in that regard. So how are we going to save our prefab now that we've done a little bit of work to it? We got those new colliders there. Well, we can delete its counterpart in our prefab folder. Notice how our prefab turns red, and then we'll just drag and drop it back into our prefab area. And now if we check floor raise, we can see we have our nice box collider. Our wall has a nice box collider. And our columned wall has a nice mesh collider. So I'm going to pause and bring in another prefab, and I'll show you what I did on a piece-by-piece basis, so you don't have to see me making all these new prefabs. So here we have my door wall. And since these are both irregularly shaped, I have the columns on this wall, and of course that's too complex for any single box collider. I just added mesh colliders on both. And this will be used anytime you need to make a doorway or a nice little archway for an intersection within your level. So let's examine this large floor area. I could obviously just put a box collider on every single piece of this prefab, but that's 9 extra colliders the engine has to worry about. But maybe there's some way where I could create a collider around this whole area and just have one large collider for the whole area. How could I do that? Well, there is a way. Let's go to Game Objects, Create Other, and let's make a plane. A simple little plane here. What we're going to do is we're going to scale this plane to roughly match the dimensions of our floor here. And you don't have to be too exact. A little bit bigger, a little bit of an overhang. Never hurt anybody. And we're going to kind of hover it right on top as much as we can. Maybe shore up that scale a little bit. And I'm going to position it just right above the floor there. And now we can turn off the mesh renderer for this piece. Now it's invisible, it won't be rendered. Let's call this floor large collider. Let's drop it in our prefab. Let's go to Add Component, Physics, Box Collider. Now we have a box collider on this invisible plane piece. One collider covering all 9 pieces of this flat floor here. And let's just give the collider a little bit of depth. There we go. And if the arrow is being too finicky, why don't we can just go in and type a numeric value, 0.01. Perfect. Just a little bit of depth on that collider. And now we have one large collider on our large floor. Great. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take our floor large old prefab without the collider, and we're just going to make a new collider right there. So here we have a curved hallway. It can be used as a left or a right, depending on which way you rotate it. And pretty much every piece of this prefab, every individual piece, there's not going to be a simple shape. A sphere won't work, a capsule won't work. we're going to have to use a mesh collider on every single piece. What's a quick way to do that? Well, we can shift click every single piece. See how I have them all selected in my outliner? And we can add a component to all of them at the same time. We go to physics and add a mesh collider. Great. Now our curved hallway has a mesh collider. Let's delete the old one without the mesh collider. Drag and drop it in. Now we have a new curved mesh with the collider. Here we have a straight hallway with a door wall substituted on one of its doors. So if you ever needed to have a hallway with a door attached, I've already got a prefab for it. Give you a little bit of an idea of what you can do with prefabs. Here I have a hallway with doors on both sides. And these should link up with any other kind of straight hallway we have in our game. I can demonstrate like so. Seamlessly connecting hallways. So I have a hallway and a door hallway like so. Alright, so that does it for all the kind of the prefabs I've made. You can, I would recommend creating some of the ones you've seen in this video. Maybe even experiment and make your own prefabs. Really go crazy with your own level. In the next video, I'll go give a preview of the level I created, so you can get a sense of idea of how you can organize your game scene and how you can build your own custom levels.